In this video, we're going to be getting into one of the most overlooked but evidence-based compounds for brain health and how it might help what researchers have coined as type 3 diabetes, aka Alzheimer's. This is personally one of my most favorite supplements, and the thing that really got me hooked on this in the first place was I saw a study on it that showed that it regenerated gray matter in the brain for patients, which is crazy. Based on my metabolomic profile, I might be switching the supplements that I'm taking every 6 to 12 months, somewhere in there. But there's two supplements that I always keep. It is number one, creatine, and number two, iso-alpha acids, which we're going to be talking about today. For me personally, it's been really important because I have very mentally demanding work, so being able to stay sharp and on point is very important. But I also have a family, so I need to go home and have energy to wrestle with the kids, work out, or invest deeper into my community, whatever it is. So in this video, we bring on Dr. Eric Khurts. He is a researcher, somebody that started off his career in drug development and design, but then later switched a little bit more into nutraceuticals and how we can take these natural compounds and use them for being very beneficial to the body. So he took the rigor of what he found in the drug development market in the sense of using an evidence-based approach and applied it to the nutraceuticals. So what he did with this compound is developed a very evidence-based approach in the sense that we're not just focusing on a couple biomarkers, and that's what a lot of supplement companies do. Rather, he took the approach of, yeah, we'll do all that stuff, but we're really going to focus on the outcome. What tangible benefit does the person experience upon taking this nutraceutical product? We're going to talk about how it affects the gut-brain axis through the vagus nerve, how it is very stimulatory for dopamine, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and all these neurotransmitters that are very important for brain function, and how it causes homeostasis and balance within those. Has a lot of other targets too. It is a broad spectrum compound, meaning that it can apply to a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different things because it's going to affect many different aspects in the body. And so that can also be seen in your panels with your patients, how it's going to move HbA1c for people with type 2 diabetes and the like. How it's going to move inflammatory cytokines. And so if you're the clinician who is looking into iso-alpha, isohumulones, etc., this video is for you. This is meant to give you a good understanding of what iso-alpha is doing so that you can assess if it's going to be a good fit for your patient base.
But they want to see evidence-based stuff. That's where we're coming from. It's like, we're saying, okay, we can compete with natural products. We can compete with the drugs in terms of efficacy for certain things with usually a much better safety profile. It's a little bit different than your classic single molecule drug, prescription drug, right? Which is like taking a sledgehammer and just hammering on one particular target. Here we're affecting a whole spectrum of different targets that are associated with different gene profiles, and then ultimately find their way upstream to complete metabolic, more macro metabolic effects.
That's part of what I love about these kind of broad spectrum solutions in the sense that we have not isolated a single compound that's having a single mechanism of action, but that we have a constellation of mechanisms that we're trying to affect, which, as you were saying earlier off camera, is that what you see in that is you see a wide variety of biomarkers affected, whether that's through obesity or through cognitive function. And so I think that really is one of the advantages of these broad spectrum type of interventions that can be applied in a wide variety of ways. So could you kind of walk me through a little bit of what inspired you initially to develop iso-alpha? What were the merits? What were you seeing here that made you say, like, this is worth investing my time into? Because you are, an inventor, you're a doctor, you're very busy, you have a lot of stuff going on. So something has to pique your interest for you really to take close attention to it.
Years and years ago, I had an interest in molecules that are contained in natural products. And in that process, I came across hops, which obviously is something that's somewhat ubiquitous, and it's in beer and so on. But some of the molecules that turned out to be medically valuable in hops don't necessarily follow through into beer, or they're not in beer in a large enough quantity to be consumed that way, because the alcohol that comes along with it is obviously not going to be beneficial. People are going to become inebriated. So beer isn't really the vehicle for consuming the beneficial molecules that are in hops. But over the years within hops, one of the carve-outs, one of the very interesting molecules that popped out was the isohumulones. Or there's a group of those molecules the principal one being isohumolone. And they're referred to more globally as iso-alpha acids, right? So those iso-alpha acids turned out to be very valuable compounds in the sense that they had broad spectrum effects on the entire metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is, as you probably know, is characterized by all these different health problems that people are facing today that can be a result of diet, they can be a result of the particular gene profile that the person has, but in many cases they're diet driven. And that's why things like the Mediterranean diet have become popular, because Mediterranean diet is obviously a way to try to control metabolic issues and then metabolic diseases, which by the way include everything from weight, from obesity to type 2 diabetes to chronic inflammation. And where that ends up taking us in terms of the isoalpha ultimately is to the brain, where neuroinflammation is a big problem, especially as people get older.
Well,
So it
and
became apparent. Yeah,
one school of thought in that too is now they've coined the term type 3 diabetes for Alzheimer's.
there you go. Yeah, so chronic neuroinflammation is really the hallmark of many of the problems that seem to be cropping up in the elderly, and not just the elderly, but it's starting much earlier. So when people get in their 30s and 40s, if they started taking preventive steps in the right direction through consumption of the right, both the right diet and also natural molecules like isohumolone, they can actually push off the whole, metabolic syndrome, actually push it out indefinitely so it doesn't become a major factor that will contribute to their lifestyle or impair their lifestyle. Because without memory and focus and intellectual capacity, we really don't have much of anything. I mean, we can have a healthy body, but obviously if our brain is clogged up and is experiencing chronic inflammation, that's not a good situation to be in. Ultimately, over years and years of chronic neuroinflammation is ultimately leading to more serious problems like Alzheimer's and so on. But we're talking about trying to intervene at an earlier stage where those problems are beginning to occur and they need to be dealt with, or they should be dealt with at that time, early on. And also to enhance the quality of life for people who are getting older, which is a significant portion of the population now. Most people don't realize that the percentage of the world population that's over 60 is huge compared to the birth rate. Birth rates have gone down, but the elderly population has gone up. So what we have really is a huge issue related to the elderly and the quality of life associated with older people, and obviously brain function, memory, and things like that, and even hand-eye coordination, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But hand-to-eye coordination and object recognition. Object recognition, an example would be, where did you put your car keys? A lot of people put their car keys in the same place every time they come home because they okay, I can find my car keys there. But a lot of people, if they put their car keys somewhere, they just simply don't remember where they are. That's an example of object recognition or memory associated with objects, which is critical to our functioning in society today. I mean, we have to have that aspect that definitely needs to be there to have proper functioning.
Yeah, we're very clearly in a metabolic crisis in the United States from, whatever that is, environmental toxins, lifestyle choices, the diet, et cetera. So, and by the way, for anybody watching that uses Therium as their metabolic test, I'm not trying to plug it, but I would be curious what you're finding, because he's going to get into some standard panels and what they can typically see when applying this intervention and the markers that are moved within standard panels. But it would be interesting to see, for those of you using the metabolomic analysis, what kind of markers you're seeing move over time. But we are clearly in a metabolic crisis in the country. What do you think is happening mechanistically with these isoalpha acids? What are they doing in the body that is helping the body to correct?
One thing that we focused on early on, which is really quite interesting, is the connection between the gut and the brain. And in that connection, because there's constantly communication going on between the gut and the brain. And one example of how important that's become is the GLP-1 drugs, the weight loss drugs. which have become the biggest selling drugs in the world at this point, because chronic obesity is another issue that is a huge problem. But in that process, the connection between the gut and the brain is critical because some signals that are being sent about feeling full is part of the aspect of how the GLP-1 drugs are working, like Ozempic and so on. And that signal is being transmitted. A lot of that signal is being transmitted via what's called the vagus nerve. Many people have heard about the vagus nerve, but people may not be familiar with how important it's become in terms of overall metabolic issues. And the communication between the gut and the brain turned out to be extremely important for the mechanism of action of how compounds like isohumulones or the isoalpha work. Because one of the things that they're doing is enhancing that communication between the gut and the brain, and they're using it having an effect on the vagus nerve to do that. Then sending signals to the brain by the vagus nerve also involves things that are called toll-like receptors or TLR, toll-like receptors. For example, TLR2 and TLR5. So those are signaling mechanisms because the signaling process is something that begins to decline as we get older. There needs to be that constant communication between different parts of the body and different cells and the genes that are in those cells and other parts of the macro cellular components in the tissues and so on. The signaling pathways are the infrastructure really that facilitates the need for communication between all the different systems. So it's really a systemic thing. And while you might affect a particular target with a prescription drug, if you don't also have an effect on the signaling processes, which are responsible for facilitating the communication all the way from the level of the gene and gene expression to the more macro cellular component that might be in some other part of the body, without also enhancing the signaling pathways. And there are different genes and different systems involved in that, but one of the principal ones is the TLR system, again, which means toll-like receptor, okay? And those are being activated as well to facilitate the communication between the body and the mind or between the gut and the brain through the vagus nerve.
And so you're seeing one of the primary mechanisms that this is helping correct is vagus nerve stimulation, and thereby homeostasis or balance is being put into effect.
That's right. So probably in the last 10 years, in particular, 10 or 20 years, but particularly the last 10 years, importance of the vagus nerve has really begun to manifest as more and more research has been done. And obviously there are devices that have been developed to stimulate the vagus nerve, and those have been, relatively successful for different things from pain to mood and depression and other types of things. But here we're talking about actually facilitating the communication through the vagus nerve to the brain and also having a profound effect on things like neuroinflammation and those different gene systems that are involved in the brain in inflammation and cytokines, for example. Everyone's heard about cytokines. I mean, when COVID occurred, everybody got very familiar with cytokines, but all these pro-inflammatory molecules, that can be stimulated and are stimulated chronically as we get older. So the overall suppression of the neuroinflammation is a key part of what's happening with the isoalpha acids, and what's facilitating that is the communication through the vagus nerve to the brain from the gut. So once the isoalpha acids are ingested, there are receptors that are called taste receptors. There's 25 different bitter taste receptors that have been identified so far. And they're located in the mouth, but they're also located in other parts of the body. And in particular, different taste receptors are located in the gut and in the intestines. And those taste receptors are responsible for when they're activated by, let's say, bitter compounds, which the isohumulone is. It's like the premier bitter compound, which also, by the way, is extremely beneficial for stomach problems. And there's an old saying that good medicine is bitter medicine, right? So the use of bitters in the old days by our ancestors was a huge part of how to settle gastrointestinal indigestion, stomach aches, all these kind of things. And the isohumulins is extremely effective for that purpose as well, which is a different purpose, a little bit off the subject of what we're talking about with the brain, but it's something to make note of because it's extremely effective for any stomach problems. But so part of what's happening is the isohumulins are also activating taste receptors in the gut because in the pill form, the isohumulins are extremely bitter. And if you try to take it in a liquid or something that passes through the mouth and is exposed to those bitter receptors, they go crazy
I
because it's
tried it.
super bitter.
I
Yeah.
tried your isoalpha acids because I figured that, somebody's gonna get it on their tongue at some point. So I should just bite into one of these capsules and give it a shot myself. And my goodness, was it bitter? It lasted for like 2 hours, just this really strong bitter taste. But you're right. I mean, there is this ancient precedence across many different cultures of using bitter compounds in medicine. And it does have a virtue, at least in that sense. They didn't have the scientific method that we do today and all the processes that you've gone through to vet this out and ensure that it's an evidence-based modality. But nonetheless, there was that, wisdom in the sense of we're looking for an outcome here. We're looking, does my stomach get better? And if that happens often enough, well, it becomes a part of the routine. And so there definitely was something to this bitter compound over many different cultures.
Yeah. So we first wondered, okay, we saw from gene expression studies that a whole bunch of different bitter taste receptors are being activated. In other words, technically that's called an agonist, right? So you have an antagonist and you have an agonist. An agonist is something that upregulates the receptor or the gene. And when we look at gene profiling and we look at those 25 different bitter taste receptors, we see which ones are being activated by the compounds, right? That's looking at the different targets. And in the beginning, we thought, okay, those are located in the mouth. Some of them are very effective for stimulating the innate immune system. And during COVID, that became very important because, if you take certain medicines that are bitter and it activates some of these specific taste receptors, like what's a TAS2R38, that's one of the 25. That one is a target for activating the innate immune system in the upper respiratory tract, which is extremely important for fighting off invading pathogens and microorganisms, right? So that's the innate immune system. But then we wondered, well, what happens if you bypass the mouth and you're not activating those taste receptors in the mouth because you're taking a pill like the isoalpha, and then it was found that those same receptors are located in the gut and in the intestine. And those receptors, when activated in the gut, stimulate an additional process that begins to communicate through a number of different ways through the vagus nerve all the way to the brain. So what that's saying is that you're stimulating certain receptors in the gut, and those same receptors are able to communicate through the vagus nerve directly to the brain, and that's the importance that is becoming apparent about gut brain or stomach to mind communication and how important it is, because a lot of people, sort of in our history as human beings, we have something that's called intuition, gut intuition. It's been around for forever. And our forefathers used to think about it as a way or sort of a form of understanding things. That if you have a gut instinct that's telling you something that you can't quite put your finger on intellectually, but it's more of a feeling. But that feeling, that gut instinct, is also due to communication between the gut and the brain via the vagus nerve. So that's how important the vagus nerve and the communication between the gut and the brain is, because now we can use a more global system of intelligence that is not just brain driven or intellectually driven, but involves other parts of the body and the whole sensory apparatus in enhancing intellectual function. which makes things a lot better, because we talked before about object recognition and how important that is, and hand-to-eye coordination, and that accidents and falls in the elderly, a lot of can be directly attributed to lack of hand-eye coordination and a loss of balance. And a lot of that loss of balance and equilibrium is coming from a decline in the integrity of the different pathways that are communicating from the muscle to the brain, from the gut to the brain, all this back and forth communication. That whole constellation is infrastructure which has declined and needs to be rebuilt or revitalized. So this is sort of isoalpha is sort of one of the systems to revitalize that aging infrastructure.
Yeah, and thankfully we don't need to, bite into the capsule, put it all over our mouth because, our gut and our stomach have the receptors in order to be able to stimulate the vagus nerve and cause this balancing effect that we're looking for. Let's go into speaking a little bit towards use cases and outcomes. What do you think, in your opinion, are the best use cases of this product? I know we're talking primarily about brain health, but feel free to extend beyond that as well, because I know you mentioned obesity, satiation experience, etc.
Right. Well, one of the one of the critical things that we talked about earlier, that everyone is concerned about, is we need some type of broad spectrum metabolic syndrome type of product, other than just changing the diet, because most people are aware that they can modify their diet, and maybe they can affect different metabolic issues by doing that. But most people don't have the discipline, and most people definitely don't have the discipline to just be able to consume a Mediterranean diet on a frequent basis, right? We're exposed to all kinds of different foods, and we can't always rely upon that type of dietary profile. So in the absence of that, what can we do? We could take something like the isoalpha or the isohumulones, and then have broad spectrum effects that are driven by a more powerful dietary additive that can affect that whole constellation of different things that are involved in the metabolic syndrome. So basically, what is a metabolic syndrome? It's that the key factors, the key health problems that are occurring are all these different things, from obesity to type 2 diabetes. And with that territory comes all kinds of other health problems. So at the beginning of the decline of the entire health of the metabolism results in things as diverse as obesity to blood sugar problems or type 2 diabetes. And that those also directly translate into brain function issues and are directly related to that, because we're really looking, if we truly are after a broad spectrum holistic solution, right, to a lot of these health problems, which is what we're trying to do with these natural products, then we need to look at all the different targets that in the last 30 or 40 years in particular have risen to the top in terms of being causal contributors to metabolic diseases. And if we can find a single or a group of single products that can address the foundational gene profiles, because everything is ultimately starting in a degenerative process that involves the genes, right? In a cell, on a genetic level, the expression of those genes, not just a single gene, but a whole group of genes, those genes get tired. They just start lacking vitality. And people have heard about mitochondria. Does involve mitochondrial genes as well, and there's effects there on the mitochondria inside the cell. And that's what longevity researchers have been looking at as a way to extend lifespan. But the critical issue here is extending lifespan in different scientific methodologies, whether it's in worms or mice or whatever. In humans, we also have to address one of the major reasons of why people die, and that's due to disease. It's not just, you get to a certain age when people get older and then they just die from old age. The majority of people are dying from a disease. And in many cases, it's cardiovascular or metabolic related. Those are the main problems, the main health problems that are arising. So going back to the beginning building blocks, what started to degenerate or fall apart as people age, and look at the basic building blocks of which genes are experiencing a significant decline that comes with aging. And not only that, which signaling pathways, which is the infrastructure, are also declining and are unable to transmit or becoming less and less strong in terms of their ability to be able to transmit and communicate between different organs, different cells, and so on in the body.
So you put out a couple of use cases that you think would be really beneficial, type 2 diabetes, and I would assume insulin sensitivity. Can you speak to that a little bit and how this might be affecting that? And then transition that into what you're seeing in other biomarkers, what a physician might expect on their panel to change once applying this.
Well, hemoglobin A1C is sort of become the major biomarker that is looked at for type 2 diabetes. Measuring glucose is fine. And along with that, obviously that's important. And also lipid profiles, meaning cholesterol and HDL, LDL, all those, those type of biomarkers are obviously important because cardiovascular disease can come with the territory, right? But when you look at hemoglobin A1C in human clinical studies, which were done with the isoalpha, there was a significant drop in glucose and changes in hemoglobin A1C. So this type of medical phenomena is documented in actual human and animal clinical studies where these biomarkers are looked, as well as obesity and the ability of these compounds to have an effect on weight loss, right? So we're talking about actual both human and animal clinicals, not just gene studies, not just cellular, what's called in vitro research, and not just gene expression, which all those things are important for understanding mechanisms. But
Well,
on a
you can
macro level,
easily overfit that, because it's very easy to take, hey, we affected this single biomarker to X degree, but if it's not married to an outcome, it becomes, and so much research is based on this when people are looking at interventions like, hey, we make this one number go up. Well, does that one number going up, do I experience life more and more fully because of it? Oftentimes, if it's devoid of the outcome, the answer can be no. And that's because we can clue in so siloed into an individual area. And I can make a narrative and a story about how this affects all these biomarkers and stuff. But then I run into the risk of overfitting. What is the actual significance of this to the individual's health? And that's where these clinical trials, this evidence-based mentality, becomes really important, because that gives us the context for what it's actually doing to what kind of outcomes we can expect with something like this.
exactly. So then from a functional standpoint, if we look at brain research that's been conducted on brains, in other words, brain studies, and one of the ways to do that is with MRI, right? And MRI scans of humans, elderly humans with development of plaque in their brains and a high level of different cytokines and so on. Not only it was noticed by the researchers in Japan who did those studies that not only were the different cytokines involved in neuroinflammation going down, but actual MRI results were positive in terms of the brain scans, right? So that's pretty significant because you're looking at the overall macro, an MRI, you're looking at overall macro phenomena.
Yeah, one of the hardest things to affect is the actual imaging of what's going on.
Yeah, so looking at things like cerebral inflammation, you can see that. You can see regions of the brain light up and so on and so forth. You can see what happens when you begin to suppress that cerebral inflammation, right? And that's significant because if it's occurring chronically, which is what happens, with in the elderly, when it becomes chronic, then it leads to more serious issues in the brain, like the neurofibrillary tangles, the plaque, the development of the plaque, and all those things, which are much harder to eliminate, once that starts to happen. So the idea here with preventive and holistic medicine, if we're really true to our goals and the vision, then it would be about a lot about prevention and a lot of reducing the causative factors that begin to occur earlier on in one's life and taking preventative measures like taking supplements like the isoalpha to reduce chronic cerebral inflammation or neuroinflammation that is occurring in the brain. And so the documentation is significant because, as I mentioned before, it's not just cell line data, it's not just genetic expression data, it's actual organic, well, human and animal, which again is in vivo evidence that's significant. And these studies are published. The Japanese did a lot of that work just over the last 5 or 6 years documenting, and so it's not just us saying that. There's actual documentation in the published literature. But what became important for the isoalpha product was a formulation that could be assimilated by the human body in something had to be done to the isoalpha acids to enable them to be properly assimilated in the gut and to actually get into the bloodstream. A lot of that involves bioavailability, enhancing the bioavailability, which means the amount that is absorbed of the active compound. But a lot of it is also reducing the impacts when you put that amount of the molecule on the stomach, because it's technically considered to be an oleoresin, right? So it's an oleoresin, which is similar to sort of a lipid or an oil type thing, but it's harder to digest. So it had to go into a particular formula that would smooth out and mitigate any gastrointestinal issues involved in compatibility. So not only the isoalpha have a proprietary formulation which facilitates its absorption, but also actually enables it to be assimilated in the gut without problems of indigestion. Because if you just took a slug of 12 acids or isohemolone, let's say you just put it in a pill and swallow it, when it hits the stomach, is the digestive juices in the stomach and the enzymes and everything really have to do a lot of work to really break down that substance and enable it to pass through the intestines into the bloodstream. What we've done with the isoalpha product is really put it into a special formulation with fatty acids and so on, which has enabled it to and facilitated not only its absorption, but the compatibility of the isoalpha acids with the gut, which was extremely important for the practical use of the compound, right? Because if you have gastrointestinal issues with taking a product, doesn't matter what you saw in the laboratory and all the great effects that maybe were occurring in the scientific research. You have to be able to take the product on a daily basis, and it needs to be not only assimilated without any side effects or digestion issues, but also increase the amount of the compound that's being absorbed into the bloodstream through the lymphatic system, as opposed to going directly through the portal vein to the liver. And that's what the proprietary formulation, the isoalpha, is in. And so that's sort of the frosting on the cake, which is on top of all the other beneficial aspects of the molecule and what it can do in terms of the macro metabolic issues that we've been talking about. But the practical bricks and mortar issue are things like, can you take it without gastrointestinal upset? Does it get into your bloodstream? If it doesn't get into the bloodstream, it's not going to have all those other effects, systemic effects on metabolic issues. But at least what we do know is if you get it into the stomach and you can get it into contact with the receptors, the taste receptors there's already going to be activity occurring by activating those receptors in the gut, even before you get systemic absorption. That's sort of the dual aspect of the product. Is we're immediately activating receptors in the gut, and we're activating the signaling system via the vagus nerve, And then once it's in the bloodstream and affecting other things, then it's having other metabolic effects like glucose and hemoglobin A1C and those type of things.
Yeah, formulation is so important because so often you can take things, right? And it's a question of, does the body assimilate this? Does it actually utilize this compound? So is this pretty well documented that, bioavailability of iso alpha is important? Because I guess one of the questions I would have from that is there's a couple places you can get isohemalones. It's not huge. I think a lot of the names, so to speak, in the industry are aware of it and the virtues of it, but it's not something that's all over brain formulas and supplements and that kind of thing. But there's a couple out there. So is that something that's well documented? And do you see or observe other people that are developing products that are not done in a way that is going to allow for bioavailability?
I would say there's very few, if any, formulas that really address those key issues, which technically we refer to them as pharmacokinetics. What's called ADME, which is absorption, metabolism, disposition, and excretion, right? That's a classic sort of holy grail of the development of drug development or development of pharmaceuticals. If you don't understand what's called the pharmacokinetics, which has to do with the absorption and the distribution, or if you don't understand the ADME, right, which is the big global picture, then you're not really scientifically developing the compound through the stages of formulation and usage, and its efficacy will be directly related to that, right? So not many people in the dietary supplement industry really focus on those things because they don't have to. But I have a background on the pharmaceutical side. I've worked on prescription drug development. And we've done a lot of ADME and pharmacokinetic research and so on over the years. And that science and that discipline is being applied to the natural product space, which is really what most companies should be doing if they want to really put out a product that is going to be a serious product, then it's going to have efficacy and not just ride on, well, there's some published literature about this chemical compound that shows it might be beneficial for some type of health problem. Well, where did that come from? Well, there was some cell line work or some gene expression work that was done in the lab that showed that natural compound might be beneficial for this particular target, which has been associated with some health problem, right? That's only the very beginning, right? That's the discovery phase, activating a particular target. But then you got to work on all the other stuff that I've just been talking about. Do you have a formulation? Is that formulation assimilable? Is it bioavailable? What are the systemic effects? And what are the more global effects? All those kind of things. So if you were to put it all in a package and put a bow on it, basically the isoalpha acid have all of those bells and whistles. It's all there. And it's not just what we're saying. If you go into the literature and you go and conduct a search on isoalpha acids, isohumulone, or any of those things, you're going to see a body of literature which backs up all these things, which is very substantial. It's probably more substantial than a lot of the research on natural compounds that has come out over the last 20 or 30 years.
Oh, it's what got my buy-in. I mean, seeing the literature on this stuff is absolutely incredible. I think this is a compound that will become more known with time, but hopefully that can be sped up through conversations like this. And, I know you are as well, but being kind of on the back end of the industry, it's really demoralizing how fast and loose a lot of these companies operate. And I'm not trying to say that in a way that's defaming them, but I think a lot of people just don't know the right questions to ask or haven't seen a model like you have in the scientific method and how you get these formulations and how you go through that process, how you ask the appropriate question at the right time. And so, as an example of that, recently, I'm not going to say which company or names or anything like that because that's not the purpose of it. It's just to serve as an example. Is we had this competitor in a different industry from what we're talking about right now, but they were making this claim about the shelf life of their product being 3 years. Like that can't be right, So let's look into this because that doesn't make any sense. They're not publishing any data. They're not putting anything out that says like, here's how we did that. So I had one of the scientists go and talk to them and ask for, what's the source on this, right? And they provided a slide set that was given by somebody, a totally different company from theirs, that This company was saying, well, we have a 3-year shelf life on ours. Here is the burden of proof, the testing that we went through, the analysis that we did, et cetera. And this is a substantial improvement over the 90-day shelf life. And really what we found in all of our competitor products is everybody had a 90-day shelf life, and ours is 3 years. And so this other company that I had the scientists go to took this other company's slide set and said, well, that must be the case for ours as well. And we'll just say it and we'll submit this as a source. And by the way, 80 to 90% of people would be totally fine with that. They wouldn't think, because when you're not on the inside of these companies and how they operate, how they should operate, the level that you should be going to, because like I'm here to make an impact on people's lives in a very positive way. My life really doesn't have a whole lot of, like, I have my family and stuff, but from a career perspective, it doesn't have a whole lot of meaning unless I accomplish that. That is what I am set on this earth to do. And so I want to make a dollar, but I want it to be as a byproduct of the virtue that I give in the product that we deliver, right? But there's a lot of people out there that are just trying to make a buck, that are just trying to get a thing spun up. And so, or it can be a competence thing, or like I said, not pattern recognition, not having seen the model of what it would look like to have a better product. And so there can be all these variables, but one thing that really gives me confidence with what you've done is really developing an evidence-based perspective on this, going all the way from, you know, the in vitro studies to in vivo, looking at humans and how it actually affects them. So my next question is a little bit more on, what do people experience when they take this? I know this is more on the anecdotal side, but I know my own experience and I can share some of that. I am a true believer in this product, but from what you've heard from people and the feedback that you've gotten over the years, what do people actually experience when they take this?
Generally, I think people experience more clarity, and obviously there's enhancement of memory and things like that. And as the communication between the gut and the brain is improved, then there's additional benefits that come along with that we've talked about in terms of the metabolic system. Because if you don't also deal with the overall macro metabolic issues, then generally speaking, you're going to feel a sense of being uncomfortable on a daily basis. In other words, I mean, we could refer to that as being in balance, right? If we're not in balance, and we're not in balance on a daily basis, then we're constantly fluctuating either up or down, and this is an issue like sleep or being awake, right? So people are either trying to fall asleep or trying to go to sleep, or they're trying to stay awake. But few people, once they get over 30, are really functioning in the productive zone, which is a zone where there's balance between all the metabolic factors that we've been talking about, and there's some that we haven't talked about, but all that universe of metabolic factors which have to do with the body, and then the universe of the mental factors which has to do with the functioning of the brain and also the mind itself, right? So anything that can enhance clarity is going to benefit people in general. Where does clarity come from? Primarily clarity, the ability to think, right? To have deductive reasoning is coming from a state of balance, right? So if we're overstimulated, we can't think properly because we're too stimulated. We're going, 110 miles an hour. We can't focus as well. If we're understimulated, we can't quite get to the point where we can grasp those things. So where's that zone where functionality is really at an optimal level? And that's a zone where people are experiencing some degree of clarity, because without that as a basis, without the basis of clarity, everything else is basically out the window. And where does that clarity come from? The clarity can come from a balancing of both the body and the mind, right? You have to deal with both. If you're just dealing with the body, but the mind is lacking clarity, that's not going to work, because maybe you might feel a little bit better, or you're not having some of these issues involved with energy and things that might be associated with type 2 diabetes, which is again a problem. I mean, not having enough energy is why people overstimulate nowadays, right? They're constantly trying to get their energy up, especially when they get over 30. And then they're trying to get the energy down when they want to go to sleep, right? So we can't keep oscillating back and forth or bouncing back and forth between those two extremes. We need to really get in the middle where the best functionality and clarity occurs. And that's that's what a product like the isoalpha is really doing. It's working with both the mental aspects and the physiological or the body aspects. But I should add a third component here after the other things that we've been talking about, and that is the extract that we produce is a proprietary extract, which not only contains the isoalpha acids, but also has other polyphenols that are contained, very valuable polyphenols that are contained in hops that are called prenoflavonoids. They're a type of flavonoid compound that's very interesting in their own rights. And we have that in there on purpose because it helps to further facilitate other aspects of the product. Like a whole other subject that could be talked about is things like mTOR. mTOR, little m and then capital T, capital O, capital R, have become very popular in longevity research recently because a bacteria was discovered in the Easter Island called rapamycin, which has become the sort of a big focal point for longevity products because the mechanism of action of what that antibiotic is doing is believed to be something that's beneficial for lengthening lifespan. And why it does that and everything is a subject of a whole other talk. But those polyphenols, those prenoflavonoids that are in the isoalpha product with the isohumulin are there to serve a very important purpose, which facilitates the functionality of the entire product. And that might all, be the subject of a completely different talk. But I'm just mentioning because it's a third component to the product we don't want to forget about or neglect, but it's something that further emphasizes and works with the isoalpha acids to facilitate all the things that we're trying to do with that product.
So I want to understand a little bit better this intervention or supplement in the context of, all the different things that a physician could be doing, right? So they could be working with L-theanine or caffeine or other things that are known to even creatine. So by the way, I kind of rotate the different supplements that I'm using based on my profile from the metabolomic analysis and that kind of thing. But there are two that I always keep, and that is creatine, and the other one is isoalpha. So I never go off that. And I would say that, one of the drawbacks of this product, and I think there are very few, but one of the drawbacks is it's for most people not an immediate experience. And we often look for an immediate
Yeah.
experience from things, right? Because if for the physician, that's great, because then the patient takes it, they have an immediate notice of what's happening. This is more of an actual brain health supplement, and that necessitates time. But I can promise that over the course of 30, 60, 90 days, it'll kind of range depending on the person, that there will be an effect and it will be positive. And for some people, it's subtle. For some people, it's strong. For me, it's more subtle at my age. I would assume that's part of the reason. But can you give me a little bit more context here on like why this over all the different brain supplements or different formulas that I could be using? Why did you make it in this way and for this market?
Well, part of the issue, I mean, with respect to the period of time where the product starts kicking in and making a big difference is it is taking time and that there's not necessarily an immediate effect. For some people, there can be an immediate effect. And by the way, it's possible, there's different people are different sizes, different weights, and so on. It's possible to take more than a single capsule dose.
I
If
take two
you're
a
a
day. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're a larger person or you're heavier person, you can take two, and even you could take three. But if you want to see more of the profound effects, more immediate effects on a daily basis, you can take more of the product, like two capsules instead of one, for example. Then that's going to produce a larger overall effect that will be more noticeable. We chose to have it a single capsule dose because the average person across the spectrum, some people are, are smaller people. They're not as tall. They're not, their body weight is not as big. And so we pick an average that falls between the whole spectrum of different types of people that are out there. But in terms of moving the metabolism and the things that the isoalpha is doing, it could be compared to, a huge cruise ship, like a tourist cruise ship going to the Mediterranean or something. If that cruise ship is the captain is trying to turn that ship, he can't turn it immediately. It takes a long time. It's sort of like, with the Titanic, the iceberg is up ahead, but you have to start turning along long before you get to close proximity to the iceberg. What that's meaning is moving the metabolism is like a giant, cruise ship, but you can't turn it overnight. You're dealing, and if you did, it may be actually impossible to really change the overall metabolism on a global and meaningful basis too quickly. You don't necessarily want to do that. There may be issues involved with that. It's much better to change it slowly over a period of a couple of months. That's a safer way, and also that's more of a longer lasting way that is effective than just taking a sledgehammer and trying to hammer it, down.
It
And
helps establish a new baseline of resilience and plasticity and adaptability, et cetera.
yeah, so people really need to understand that though they may not experience some immediate effects from taking the product, if they take it over a period of 2 or 3 months, there's going to be that every day, that gradual chipping away at the different metabolic deficiencies and issues. And over time, it's going to start moving that boat in the right direction and changing the direction. And that's a much safer way to begin to change the overall direction that our bodies are going, as we age. It's much safer to more gradually, because to be able to move the metabolism, it's quite a major feat. I mean, there's very few things really that can do that. And I should add one other target that we focused on, and that's been focused on with the ISO alpha, is a target called PPAR, which is the focal point for a lot of type 2 diabetes drugs and obesity drugs and so on. The isohumolones have a profound effect on PPAR gamma, which is a major target for metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. So that's another thing that can be identified that's being changed or targeted that explains some of the metabolic changes and phenomena that occur. There are multiple targets involved, but if you had to pick the top 4 or 5, PPAR gamma, that's one of the big ones.
And so if we were, looking at the marketplace of things, like I said, L-theanine, caffeine, modafinil, adaptogens, et cetera, what stands out about ISO alpha?
If there's any supplement that really has the kind of profound effects on the vagus nerve and that mechanism of action, which we focused on primarily, although there are many other health benefits and other mechanisms, that are too numerous to mention all of them. We touched on a few of them, but we're focused primarily on the brain and the vagus nerve because that's a different target than other supplements have really focused on. And it's a valid target that's been established scientifically over the last 20 years. So it's not lacking in evidence-based research to support that as a valid target. But we felt that it would be more unique, and that's what sets the ISO alpha product apart from many of the other nootropics or brain supplements, right? They can't really make a claim to having effects on the gut brain axis, the vagus nerve, and more directly, things like neuroinflammation and this, particular cytokines that become chronically elevated in the brain. We're talking about some real specific targets there. And most of the other supplements can't really point to that kind of evidence-based research.
Yeah. Yeah. And furthermore, I would add too that there's probably some good ones out there. So I'm not saying that there's not, but I have seen quite a few supplement companies. They'll be 110, 140 bucks a bottle, something really expensive, but they're also very stimulant heavy. For me, I like to drink my stimulants, right? My caffeine, my green tea, and my coffee. I don't want it in there. But, the reason that they do that is for, like I said, that immediate effect that people are looking for. It's not really for, and there can be some brain boosting stuff. That's fine with that. Like I said, I drink the coffee and the green tea and that kind of thing because I do like the effect of that. However, I think, in the consideration of we're trying to steer that ship, we're trying to get a metabolic change, we don't need to add stimulants to it. We really just need to draw out the power and the potential of this product and deliver it in its most raw form possible, along with the formulations that make it bioavailable. But yeah, it's a terrific product. And I think within the marketplace of things, this really stands out to me as a true brain health supplement, plus a ton of other added benefits that we've talked about, like with the HbA1c and the different markers that it can move there. Could
Yeah.
you perhaps, real quick, list some of the other markers that a physician might expect to see moved over the course of a few months after taking this, just so that they can kind of,
Yeah.
as they're getting their
Well,
toes in the water with this, see what they would expect on their panels?
one of the things that I wanted to mention that's important in terms of biomarkers or overall nootropic activity are neurotransmitters. We haven't really talked much about that so far, but I want to emphasize two neurotransmitters in particular that are involved in the transmission of the signals that are coming from the gut to the brain and the vagus nerve, and that's dopamine and norepinephrine. So a lot of people are taking stimulants and so on to directly stimulate the production of neurotransmitters. There's another way to activate those neurotransmitters, which decline with age, by the way, and that's having direct effects with isoalpha on dopamine and norepinephrine neurotransmitters by activating the receptors and the genes that are involved in it. And that's a key component here. And the reason we don't talk that much about it because a lot of people don't understand. Okay, can you tell me how norepinephrine and dopamine and things like that have, what do they have to do with brain function and memory? And that gets into a whole more complicated discussion involving neurobiology and receptor mediated phenomena and things like that. Some people are familiar with that, and obviously many healthcare professionals are familiar with those things. But the two key neurotransmitters here that we're affecting are norepinephrine and dopamine, and that's huge. That's a huge added benefit because that's another reason why people are taking so many stimulants. And what we're more bringing those neurotransmitters into homeostasis, right? Because when I talked about balance before, the technical term for balance is really homeostasis, right? Bringing things into a level to a natural level. That's extremely important. Not overstimulating, because then there's a reaction that comes from overstimulation, right? Overstimulation with stimulants then results in a corresponding reaction, which is understimulation. So you pay for it, right? But with homeostasis or with the balance, even though it might not be quite as exciting in terms of stimulation, ultimately over the long term, getting into balance and having homeostasis between mind and body is really the true and longer lasting way to deal with issues that we've been talking about.
Yeah, yeah, and I have had in my life different points. I actually used to drink like over a pot of coffee a day. I can't remember how many milligrams of caffeine, but something like 1,500, 1,400 milligrams of caffeine a day, which is a lot. That's very, very excessive. That means 24 hours later, I still have a few cups of coffee in my system. And now I'm at the point where I have a single cup of coffee in the morning, and then I usually have 2 cups of green tea during the day. I do want to ask though, we've talked to a degree about older folks. We've talked about people that have signs of cognitive decline. We have talked about people who have type 2 diabetes or perhaps pre diabetic. Do you anticipate this to be a helpful product to somebody who's just really healthy and doesn't necessarily have any signs or symptoms of an iceberg on the horizon?
Absolutely. I mean, I take the product myself because in general, and I don't have any of those metabolic issues. I don't have type 2 diabetes or any of those things. I take the product anyway because all the different issues involved in what I was talking about earlier, having to do with balance and clarity. And also, things like dopamine, those neurotransmitters are involved in in things like hand-eye coordination involving gambling, right? So let's say you're pulling the slot machine, right? You're watching the things. It's a kind of feedback mechanism that's, abusing the hand-eye coordination phenomena in the brain. And it's pulling down on the neurotransmitter supply in a meaningless process that isn't really resulting in any long-lasting phenomena, right? So people don't realize how important those neurotransmitters are to overall daily functioning, and they get abused all the time, either with substance abuse or even something as simple as gambling or playing games on their cell phone, right? This is constantly scrolling and going through things, and that's involving the dopamine. And people get attached, they become addicted. Dopamine is directly related to all kinds of addictive phenomena, right? And addictive phenomena, it could be on a small level that is harmful, just like playing a game on your cell phone or something, but it's a distraction which people don't realize is pulling down your dopamine receptor activity. And there's going to be a price to pay for that later. And so, one of the things I would tell people, if you want to really function better and more productively from a clear space, try to avoid obsessive phenomena that's involving a drawdown of the dopamine receptor and productive dopamine, which is this sort of addictive attachment to phenomena, repeated phenomena like gambling or playing games and so on. And people people probably don't think, well, just playing a game on my cell phone, that can't be that harmful. It's not that it's harmful in terms of, being addictive like a drug or something, but what is happening is that you pay a price for that addictive behavior, if it's becoming sort of obsessive compulsive. And that price is you're pulling down the neurotransmitter supply in your brain, and you need to replenish. The sooner you replenish it, the better. So one of the things that isoalpha is doing is going to help people with is, even though they can't stop that compulsive behavior, what they could do is reinvigorate the that dopamine system. They're here, we're just focusing on a specific aspect of everyday life that people might run into, and what isoalpha where it could be beneficial in that. And it's in that sort of addictive behavior area, which might seem harmless, but it affects the overall ability of the brain to be able to function with better clarity, because it 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 it, it will decline for a period of time, maybe a half a day or a couple of days, if somebody is engaged in that activity on a continual basis for hours. They're going to pay a price. And usually the recovery where things are not where things are restored back to in homeostasis, right, back to a level that's proper for normal functioning, where you don't have all these distractions constantly happening, right, and your adrenaline is not constantly being pumped. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is isoalpha is really a product for our modern lifestyle, where we're constantly being exposed to addictive phenomena, and we're constantly being pulled away from balance by all these different distractions.
Really love the product. I recommend anybody listening, just give it a try. I think you're not going to be disappointed with it. It has a money back guarantee on it. I can't remember the timeline, but it's within the whatever the recommended use timeline is. So give it a try. And Dr. Khurts, I really appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks so much.